The wind howled through the night like an angry beast, relentless and cold. The storm was fierce, the kind that could strip a man to his bones and leave nothing but frost behind. Thatcher Boone, his face grim and his breath coming in quick, ragged gasps, scanned the endless white of the blizzard. His horse's hooves barely made a sound as they cut through the snow, his body bracing against the icy sting of the wind. He had been searching for hours, the snow biting into his skin, his eyes straining against the blinding whiteness. His mind was focused on only one thing: Lori Mayfield. She had been on his mind ever since he heard she had left. She was out there somewhere, walking alone in the mountains, determined to make her way to the next town. But Thatcher knew the storm was coming, and if she didn't get shelter soon, she would never make it. The thought gnawed at him, pushing him forward through the darkness and the cold. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he saw her. Lori was collapsed on the snow-covered ground, barely conscious, her face pale and lips blue. Her clothes were torn and caked with ice, her body frozen from the cold. Thatcher's heart slammed at his chest as he leaped from his horse and rushed to her side. "Lori," he shouted, shaking her, his voice thick with urgency. But she didn't respond, her eyelids fluttering weakly. She was slipping in and out of consciousness, her life hanging by a thread. He scooped her up with surprising tenderness for a man used to the harshness of ranch work. She was light in his arms, fragile as a bird, and her skin was icy to the touch. Every moment felt like a battle against time as he raced back to the ranch, his horse galloping desperately through the storm. The wind whipped around them, but Thatcher barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the woman in his arms, willing her to stay alive, to hold on just a little longer. By the time they reached the warmth of the ranch, Thatcher was breathless and covered in a thin layer of frost. He carried Lori inside, laying her gently by the fire in the main room. Her breathing was shallow, her chest barely rising. Mrs. Chun, the housekeeper, rushed to help, throwing a blanket over Lori's shivering body. Thatcher's hands trembled as he rubbed her skin, trying to warm her. It was clear she was near death's door, but Thatcher couldn't help but feel the weight of something else: guilt. He hadn't meant for this to happen. He had never wanted her to end up like this. Hours passed as Thatcher sat by her side, watching her closely. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows against the walls. Mrs. Chun made sure the room was warm and kept a steady supply of hot tea by Thatcher's side. But Thatcher barely touched it, his eyes never leaving Lori's face. She was unconscious, but there was a quiet strength in her even now, a resistance to the cold that Thatcher admired. He hadn't expected to find her here, in his house, under these circumstances. But there was no denying the truth. He had saved her. For now, at least. It wasn't until the third day that Lori stirred. Her eyes fluttered open, and she winced at the light filtering through the windows. For a moment, she didn't seem to know where she was. Then, her gaze locked onto Thatcher, who was sitting at the edge of the bed, exhausted but still vigilant. His face was gaunt, dark circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept in days. Lori blinked, confusion clouding her eyes. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice hoarse. Thatcher, his jaw tight, looked at her with a mix of relief and something deeper that he couldn't place. "You're at Boone Ranch," he said quietly. "I found you in the storm." Lori's eyes widened in horror as she sat up too quickly, wincing at the dizziness. "No," she whispered, her breath catching. "I have to leave." Thatcher didn't move, his face hardening. He didn't understand her panic, but he wasn't about to argue. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly. "The storm's still raging. You're trapped here until it clears." Lori's face twisted in a mix of disbelief and anger. "I don't care. I can't stay here. Not with you." Thatcher's gaze softened, and he took a step toward her, his voice low and steady. "I didn't save you so you could run off and die out there. You're staying, Lori. You have no choice." Before Lori could respond, Mrs. Chun appeared in the doorway, her expression filled with concern. "Mr. Thatcher, you haven't slept in 3 days," she said gently. "You need rest." Thatcher's eyes shifted, as though he were going to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he turned away and headed toward the door. Lori's eyes followed him, a mix of emotions crossing her face. She wanted to be angry, to lash out at the man who had taken everything from her. But there was something else too, a strange, uncomfortable gratitude. The storm raged on outside, relentless and unforgiving. And in that moment, Lori realized with a chill crawling up her spine, she was trapped, not just by the storm, but by something she couldn't yet understand. And that was the beginning of everything. As she lay back in bed, staring at the ceiling, she wondered, why had Thatcher saved her? What was he really thinking? The man who had taken her land, her home, had now kept her alive when she should have been left to freeze in the snow. She didn't know whether to be grateful or hate him more. But as the snow piled higher outside, she understood one thing. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was about to break between them. The days passed slowly in the warmth of the ranch. But for Lori, each one was a battle between bitterness and confusion. On the first day after she woke, she refused to speak, eat, or even look at Thatcher. She lay in the bed, wrapped in blankets, her mind spiraling in anger and disbelief, but Thatcher didn't press her. He continued to bring her meals, leaving them by the bedside without a word, his face unreadable. He didn't force her to engage, letting her remain in her silence. But it was hard to ignore the details around her. The room was not just a place of refuge. It had been prepared for her, carefully. Her clothes had been mended, her boots repaired, and on a nightstand, her father's notebook sat untouched, as though it had been preserved with careful hands. Why would he care? She didn't understand. As the storm continued to rage outside, cutting them off from the world, Lori wandered through the large house, feeling both like a prisoner and an uninvited guest. On the second day, Mrs. Chun took the day off, leaving Lori and Thatcher alone for the first time. The quiet seemed unbearable. Thatcher, in an unexpected display of domesticity, was cooking breakfast. The smell of sizzling bacon and coffee filled the room. Lori watched, unsure of what to make of this new side of the man who had destroyed her life. They sat at the kitchen table in awkward silence, both uncomfortable in the shared space. When Lori's hands trembled, she accidentally dropped her coffee cup, sending it crashing to the floor. Thatcher immediately reached for the broken pieces, his hand brushing against hers as they both tried to clean up the mess. The touch lingered longer than either of them intended, and for a brief moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Thatcher's voice was soft, his tone uncharacteristically gentle as he muttered, "I'll get it. You're still recovering." Lori's heart beat a little faster. She hadn't expected this from him. As the day wore on, the awkwardness hung in the air like a thick fog. When Lori finally spoke, her voice was sharp with suspicion. "Why were you out in that storm?" she demanded. Thatcher's gaze faltered for a moment before he answered, "Looking for cattle." But Lori wasn't fooled. "That's a lie," she replied, her tone icy. Thatcher sighed, and for the first time, he didn't mask the frustration in his eyes. "You're right," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "I was looking for you." Lori's breath caught in her throat. "Why would you search for me?" she asked, her voice a mix of disbelief and anger. Thatcher's gaze dropped, and he shrugged slightly, the weight of the confession making him seem smaller, more vulnerable. "Because I heard you left," he said, his voice tight. "The storm was coming. I knew you'd take the mountain path. I didn't want you to die out there." Lori's eyes narrowed, the anger building inside her. "So you could play hero?" she spat. "No," Thatcher replied, his voice steady. "So you wouldn't die." He didn't explain further, and Lori didn't push for more. The truth, or whatever it was, hung between them, thick and uncomfortable. The rest of the day was spent in silence, each person lost in their own thoughts. As night fell, the storm only grew worse, the winds howling louder than ever. Thatcher and Lori were forced to share the same room for warmth, the fire crackling in the hearth casting long shadows on the walls. There was no escaping the tension now. The snow piled higher outside, and Lori found herself staring at the flames, her thoughts swirling. Finally, she broke the silence. "Tell me the truth. About the land." Thatcher froze, his body stiffening as though he had been expecting the question but dreading it all the same. The storm outside seemed to howl louder in the silence that followed. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. The flickering firelight caught his face, casting it in shadows, and Lori could see the flicker of something deep inside him. Guilt, perhaps, or regret. "The truth." Thatcher finally spoke, his voice rough. He turned away from her and walked to the desk in the corner, pulling out a bundle of papers. "I'll tell you everything," he said, his voice low, as he began to unfold the papers. "But it's not what you think." And with that, in the dim light of the fire and the sound of the storm outside, Thatcher Boone began to speak the words that would shatter everything Lori thought she knew. The fire crackled softly as Thatcher began to unravel the tangled web of lies that had bound their fates together. Lori listened, her heart hammering in her chest, as he explained the complicated history between their families. "My father and your father were friends once," Thatcher said, his voice heavy with the weight of old memories. "They fought side by side, but over time, things changed. They disagreed over water rights, and that destroyed both of our families. My father became obsessed with land, with power, with winning, and that obsession cost us everything." Lori sat frozen, every word from Thatcher's mouth shattering her understanding of the past. She had always thought of him as the villain, the man who had stolen her home and left her destitute. But now, as she listened to him speak, the truth twisted in a way she never expected. "When my father died, I inherited his hatred for your family," Thatcher continued, his face hard as he looked at her. "I went to that courthouse to stop the annexation. I tried to stop the transfer of your land, but the judge wouldn't listen. He said the law was the law, and that was that." Lori's mind raced as the revelation hit her like a blow. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling. "You went to the courthouse to stop it? You were trying to return my land." Thatcher nodded slowly, his gaze falling to the floor. "By the time I filed the papers to return your land to you, you were already gone," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I sent writers. I posted notices. But you vanished. I didn't know where you were." Lori stared at him in disbelief, her mind reeling. How could this be true? If he had really tried to give her back the land, why had she never heard from him? "I was in town the whole time," she said, the anger bubbling up once again. "I could have been there. Why didn't you find me?" Thatcher's face tightened, and he looked away. "I didn't know where you went. It was like you disappeared without a trace." Lori's hand shook as she tried to piece together the fragments of their shared past, the hurt and betrayal twisting inside her. But just as she was about to ask more questions, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Chun stepped inside, her expression tense. "There's more, Miss Mayfield," she said, her voice low. Lori's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Chun hesitated, then looked at Thatcher, her face filled with guilt. "It's not just Mr. Thatcher who's to blame," she said quietly. "It's Dalton. He was the one who sabotaged everything." Lori blinked in shock. "Dalton?" she echoed, her mind struggling to keep up. "The foreman." Mrs. Chun nodded, her voice barely audible. "Dalton was embezzling from Mr. Thatcher. He intercepted all the search parties, told them you had moved east, and kept Mr. Thatcher distracted so he could cover his theft." Lori's breath caught in her throat as the truth settled like a stone in her chest. "But why?" she whispered. Mrs. Chin's face was filled with regret. "Dalton needed to get away, to cover his tracks. He took the money and ran 3 days before the storm. He's gone now, but he was the one who betrayed both of you." The silence in the room was deafening as Thatcher absorbed the weight of Mrs. Chen's words. His face contorted with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Dalton," he muttered, the anger in his voice raw. "He lied. He stole from me, from her. And I couldn't see it." Laurie's anger flared, but this time it wasn't directed at Thatcher. It was the realization that both she and Thatcher had been victims of the same man, of the same betrayal, that stung the most. "We were both used," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. Thatcher's eyes met hers, and for the first time, there was no bitterness, no walls between them. Only shared pain. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, full of regret. "I didn't know. I should have done more. I failed you." Laurie's heart twisted at the sincerity in his words. She hadn't expected an apology from him, especially not one so raw. She shook her head slowly. "You didn't know," she whispered, the walls between them starting to crumble. They were both broken in different ways, both betrayed by the same man. As the night stretched on, the truth continued to unravel, and with it, the heavy burden of misunderstanding that had kept them apart for so long. In the flickering firelight, something shifted between them, something neither of them had expected. Thatcher and Laurie were no longer enemies. They were survivors bound by the same pain, the same loss. And for the first time, the distance between them felt a little smaller. The tension between Thatcher and Laurie had shifted in a way neither of them had expected. The fire crackled on the hearth, its warm glow lighting the room as they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging heavy between them. Despite the growing connection, neither one of them could ignore the unspoken truths, the scars of betrayal that still lingered. It wasn't until the fifth night, as they sat playing cards by the fire, that the emotional walls they had both built started to crumble. The cards shuffled between them, the simple act of playing a game offering a temporary reprieve from the chaos of their lives. Laurie, her hands still slightly unsteady from her time spent recovering, glanced up at Thatcher. "I was wrong about you," she said quietly, her voice betraying a softness she hadn't shown before. Thatcher met her gaze, the years of guilt and regret softening his hardened expression. "You weren't," he replied, his voice just as soft. "I should have tried harder to make things right." Laurie shook her head, the flickering fire casting shadows on her face. "You tried. That's more than anyone else did," she whispered. The moment stretched, their eyes locking, and for a heartbeat, it seemed as if the entire world had fallen away. They were close, closer than they had ever been, both of them feeling the gravity of everything unsaid. Without warning, they leaned in, the distance between them closing, lips almost touching, when suddenly a loud crash rang through the air. The sharp sound of a tree branch snapping under the weight of the storm outside shattered the fragile moment, and both of them jumped back, flustered and embarrassed. Thatcher quickly stood, his breath shallow as he stepped toward the door. "I'll check it out," he muttered, his voice strained. Laurie, heart racing, couldn't help but touch her lips, the warmth of the almost kiss lingering on her skin. But it wasn't just the kiss. It was everything. The way he looked at her, the way he had cared for her when no one else had. As Thatcher disappeared into the storm, Laurie sat frozen in the glow of the firelight, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions she didn't know how to process. Thatcher was everything she hated, everything she had spent months resenting and blaming for the destruction of her life. And yet, there was something about him, something beneath the bitterness and the anger, that made her want to stay. She wasn't sure if it was guilt or something deeper, but she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't ignore him. Outside, the wind howled, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly. When Thatcher returned, soaked to the bone, he was visibly shaken, his body stiff from the cold. He quickly removed his wet coat and collapsed into a chair by the fire, his face flushed with the chill. Laurie, still in a daze from their earlier exchange, moved to help him, gently tugging at the edges of his coat, her fingers brushing against his skin. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Thatcher, his voice hoarse and raw, broke the silence. "I need to tell you something," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "At the courthouse when I saw you," he hesitated, as if struggling to find the right words. "I thought you were the bravest person I'd ever seen. I was terrified for you, for your future. And when I heard you were struggling, it killed me." Lori swallowed hard, her heart fluttering in her chest. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked, her voice soft. Thatcher turned away, his jaw tightening. "Because you hated me," he replied. "And you had every right to." Lori stared at him for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. "I don't hate you," she said quietly. "I don't know what I feel anymore, but it's not hate." It was the truth, and both of them knew it. The words hung in the air between them, raw and unspoken. But before either of them could process what had just been said, the door to the room suddenly burst open, and Mrs. Chun rushed in, her face pale with panic. "Sir, fire in the south barn. Horses trapped," she cried, her voice frantic. The calm they had shared evaporated instantly, replaced by a sense of urgency. Without thinking, Thatcher and Lori sprang into action. They grabbed their coats, racing into the storm with nothing but the light of the flickering fire to guide them. The snow whipped around them, the winds so fierce they could barely see. The barn was visible in the distance, the orange glow of flames licking at the sky. Smoke billowed into the air, choking the night with its thick, acrid scent. "We need to get the horses out," Thatcher shouted over the roar of the wind. The two of them worked together, desperately fighting against the fire and smoke. Lori's hands were frozen, but she didn't care. The horses were her focus, the only thing that mattered right now. She led them out of the barn, her heart pounding in her chest as she guided them through the thickening smoke. Thatcher was beside her, pulling one of the last horses free, when a beam from the ceiling above them cracked, sending a shower of sparks and debris tumbling down. Lori barely had time to react before the beam crashed down, heading straight for her. Without thinking, Thatcher lunged forward, pushing her aside with all his strength. The beam struck him instead, hitting his shoulder and arm with a sickening thud. Lori screamed in horror as he crumpled to the ground, the pain on his face making her stomach drop. "Thatcher!" she cried, rushing to his side. He was dazed, blood seeping through his clothes, his face pale and covered in sweat. "I'm fine," he muttered weakly, but the look in his eyes told her everything. He wasn't fine. They staggered back to the ranch, the barn still burning in the distance. Mrs. Chun helped them inside, and Lori immediately began tending to Thatcher's injuries. His breathing was shallow, his body burning with fever from the exposure. She worked quickly, trying to stop the bleeding, but her hands trembled with the weight of everything that had just happened. As the night dragged on, Thatcher's fever worsened. Lori, exhausted and scared, stayed by his side, not knowing what to do. She read from her father's notebook to him, her voice shaking as she tried to comfort him in his unconscious state. And as she sat there, tending to his wounds, she whispered words she didn't expect to say. "I was angry at you because it was easier than being angry at the world. But you're better than I thought. And I'm terrified because I'm starting to care. Please wake up." But Thatcher didn't answer. He was lost in the fever, slipping in and out of consciousness. And with every passing hour, Lori could feel her own heart unraveling, torn between the man who had destroyed her life and the man who had saved it. By dawn, when the light of the new day began to creep in through the windows, Lori's heart sank as she realized the truth. She might lose him the same way he had almost lost her. Only this time, it wasn't the cold that would claim him. This time it was time itself. As dawn broke over the snow-covered landscape, Lori sat beside Thatcher, her fingers gently brushing his forehead, willing him to wake up to pull through. The room was silent, except for the crackle of the fire and the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Thatcher's condition had worsened throughout the night. his fever spiking dangerously high as the hours stretched on. Despite her best efforts to tend to his wounds, the burning sensation of helplessness clung to her like the weight of the snowstorm still raging outside. His once strong and sturdy form now seemed fragile, his breathing shallow, his face flushed with fever. Lori knew she had to do something, but what could she do when she was at the mercy of the storm and time itself? She sat in the chair beside his bed, her body stiff with exhaustion, the candlelight flickering on the walls casting long shadows that seemed to mock her helplessness. Her hands were still trembling from the rush of adrenaline, from the terror she had felt when the barn had collapsed around them, when she had seen the man who had once been her enemy fall beneath the weight of the fire. She couldn't stop thinking about how he had thrown himself in front of her, how he had saved her life at the risk of his own. It was a simple gesture, but had changed everything. For the first time, she saw him, not as the man who had destroyed her life, but as someone who, despite all his flaws, cared enough to put himself in danger to protect her. The realization made her chest tighten. She had spent so long hating him, blaming him for taking away everything that mattered to her. But now, looking at him, vulnerable and broken, her heart was filled with a confusing mix of emotions: fear, anger, and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. It was as if the walls she had built around herself, the walls that had kept her safe for so long, were crumbling piece by piece, and she didn't know how to stop it. She didn't know if she was ready to face what was happening between them. For a long while, the only sound in the room was the wind howling outside, the storm still clinging to the land as if it were trying to tear them apart. Lori's eyes closed for just a moment, but when she opened them, she saw that Thatcher's eyes were flickering. His eyelids fluttered before finally opening, and his gaze met hers, unfocused at first, but slowly sharpening as he regained his bearings. "Lori," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. The sound of her name on his lips was enough to send a shiver through her, and she immediately leaned closer to him. "I'm here," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're safe now." Thatcher blinked slowly, his brow furrowing in confusion. He tried to sit up, but winced, the pain from his injuries evident. Lori quickly placed a hand on his chest, urging him to lie back down. "Don't move," she said urgently. "You're not strong enough yet." Thatcher's eyes softened, and he gave a weak smile, his lips cracked and dry. "You saved me," he murmured, his words hoarse. Lori swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. "No," she replied, shaking her head. "You saved me." There was a long silence between them, a silence filled with unspoken words, with the weight of everything that had happened in the past days. The betrayal, the confusion, the anger, and the slow shift from hatred to something else. Finally, Thatcher spoke, his voice tinged with guilt. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, his gaze dropping to the bed as if he couldn't bear to look at her. "I never meant to hurt you." Lori's heart clenched at the sincerity in his voice. She had always thought of him as the villain, the man who had taken everything from her. But now, as she looked at him, she saw the pain in his eyes, the same pain she had felt for so long. "I know," she said softly. "I know you didn't." There was a long pause as they both processed the weight of the moment, of the truth that was slowly but surely being laid bare between them. Lori took a deep breath, her eyes searching his face, looking for any sign of the man she had once thought she hated. But all she saw now was a man broken by his own choices, a man who had tried and failed to make things right. "I was angry," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was angry at you because it was easier than being angry at the world. But I see now that you were just as much a victim as I was." Thatcher's eyes softened, and he reached out, his hand trembling as he took hers. "You have every right to be angry," he said quietly. "You lost everything because of me." Lori squeezed his hand, her chest tightening. "I lost everything," she agreed. "But I also found something in you." The words hung in the air, heavier than either of them expected. There was no going back now, no pretending that the past could be forgotten. But in that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer enemies. They were two broken people, scarred by their pasts, but learning to rebuild together. "I don't know what to do with all of this," Lori whispered, her voice filled with uncertainty. Thatcher gave a soft, understanding smile. "Neither do I," he admitted. "But maybe we don't need to figure it all out right now." The storm outside began to subside, the winds softening as if nature itself was giving them a brief respite. The silence between them grew comfortable, a shared understanding settling between them. But as the days stretched on, something shifted. The storm outside may have ended, but a new one was brewing between them, a storm of emotions, of unspoken feelings, of regrets and hopes. Thatcher had saved her life, but Lori knew that saving him from his own guilt and loneliness was going to be a far more complicated task. As the storm finally cleared and the sun began to shine through the cracks in the windows, the world outside seemed to promise new beginnings, new chances for both of them. But they both knew it wasn't going to be easy. Healing would take time, forgiveness would take time, and rebuilding trust would take even longer. But Lori had learned something important in those quiet days at the ranch. Sometimes, the people who hurt you the most are also the ones who can help heal you. And maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to heal each other. As Thatcher finally closed his eyes and let out a weary sigh, Lori sat beside him, her fingers gently brushing his hair back from his forehead. She didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. "You're safe now," she whispered again, her voice full of promise. And maybe, just maybe, they both were. The days that followed were filled with quiet moments, small victories, and slow but steady healing. The storm outside had passed, leaving the world blanketed in pristine white snow. But it was the storm within that still raged, simmering beneath the surface between Thatcher and Lori. Despite the fragile peace between them, there was still much to be resolved. Unanswered questions, lingering doubts, and the undeniable weight of their shared past. Lori had tended to Thatcher's wounds with care, watching over him as he regained his strength. There were moments when their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, a tension that neither could ignore. But there were also times when the silence between them was filled with a quiet understanding, as though they had both accepted the reality of their situation. The healing was slow, but it was real. Thatcher had made it through the worst of the fever, his strength slowly returning. And now, it was time for them to face what had happened between them, to confront the truth and decide what came next. As the days turned into weeks, the ranch began to come alive again. The once frozen land started to thaw, the snow melting and revealing patches of green beneath. The first hints of spring began to show, and with it, a sense of renewal that mirrored what was happening between Thatcher and Lori. They spent more time together, working side by side to repair the ranch, tending to the animals, and gradually rebuilding what had been broken. There was no sudden spark, no magical moment when everything was fixed. Instead, it was a steady, quiet process, a slow unfurling of trust, of shared laughter, and the simple joy of companionship. Lori found herself beginning to let go of the bitterness that had consumed her for so long. The anger that had once burned so fiercely within her had softened, replaced by a grudging understanding. Thatcher, too, seemed to be changing. He wasn't the same man who had first walked into her life, the man who had taken everything from her. He was trying, in his own way, to make amends, to show her that he wasn't the enemy anymore. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was enough. One evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, Thatcher pulled out the land transfer papers he had shown her days earlier. He sat down beside Lori by the fire, his expression serious but soft. "These are yours," he said, his voice steady but filled with an undercurrent of something deeper. "They always were. Lori glanced at him, a strange pang of something in her chest. She took the papers from his hands, her fingers brushing against his, and examined them once more. The land that had once been a symbol of her loss now felt like a relic from the past, something she no longer needed. She set the papers down gently on the table and looked up at him. "I don't want them," she said quietly. Thatcher's brow furrowed in surprise. "What do you mean?" he asked, confusion clouding his features. Lori's eyes softened, her gaze distant for a moment as she considered her words. "That land was my past," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I can't live there without seeing what I lost. But here with you, I see what I found." There was a long pause, a moment of quiet understanding between them. Thatcher's lips parted as if to say something, but he didn't, and instead, he just nodded, a soft smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Lori took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. "A home," she said simply. "Not in a place, but in a person." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Thatcher's eyes glistened, and for a moment, Lori thought she saw something shift within him, something that mirrored what she had been feeling for weeks. He reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he held it in his. "Stay with me," he said, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "Not because you have nowhere else to go, but because this is where you want to be." His words hit her like a wave, crashing over her in a rush of emotions she hadn't been ready for. She stared at him, her heart racing in her chest, as the weight of what he was offering sank in. Thatcher wasn't just asking her to stay. He was asking her to choose him, to choose this life they were beginning to build together. And for the first time in a long while, Lori felt the stirrings of hope, of something new, something she hadn't dared to believe in for so long. I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice trembling. Thatcher smiled softly, a warmth in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. "You don't have to say anything," he said, his thumb gently brushing over her hand. "I don't have pretty words, but I have a promise." He paused, his gaze steady as he held her eyes. "I promise to build a life with you, a real one. Not because I'm trying to make up for what happened, but because I want this, I want you, and I want to do this together." Lori's breath caught in her throat as the words settled in. She had spent so long trying to rebuild her life on her own, trying to hold on to the remnants of the past. But now, with Thatcher's words hanging in the air, she realized that it was time to let go of the past completely. It was time to embrace something new, something better. "Yes," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. "Not because you saved me, but because you saw me. All of me." Thatcher's eyes softened, and without another word, he lifted her from her chair and spun her around in a joyful, exuberant gesture. Lori laughed, her heart light for the first time in what felt like forever. They stood there, in the warmth of the firelight, the weight of their past still lingering but no longer holding them back. As they shared a quiet kiss, one that was gentle and full of promise, Lori felt a sense of peace settle over her. This wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Over the next few months, the ranch came alive in ways Lori had never imagined. The land that had once been a symbol of loss now felt like a place of hope, a place of new beginnings. Thatcher and Lori worked together to restore the ranch, to turn it into something that was truly theirs. They planted a garden with their father's notes, each seed representing a new chapter, a new possibility. Thatcher surprised her one day by building a small memorial on the land where her parents had been buried. A stone marker, simple but beautiful, that read, "In memory of those who loved the land and all it gave." Lori cried when she saw it, her heart full of gratitude for the man who had shown her that there was more to life than loss. A few months later, they had a small, simple wedding in town, with Mrs. Chun as their only guest, a handful of friends, and the town's acceptance. The wedding ring was handmade by a local blacksmith, a simple silver band that felt like a perfect symbol of the life they were building together. They spoke their vows at her parents' gravesite, surrounded by the land that had once been a source of pain, but was now a place of healing. As the seasons passed and the ranch blossomed, so did their love. And when the first anniversary of the storm came, with the winter snow beginning to fall once again, Lori found herself standing at the spot where Thatcher had first found her. She was pregnant now, her belly round with the life they had created together. Thatcher stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her, holding her close as they watched the snow fall gently around them. "You all right?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her neck. Lori smiled, leaning back into his embrace. "Just remembering," she said quietly. "A year ago, I was dying here." Thatcher kissed the top of her head, his voice soft as he replied, "And now?" Lori touched her belly, her heart full of love and hope. "Now I'm more alive than I've ever been." Together, they walked to the small wooden cross that marked the spot where Thatcher had found her, a symbol of their shared history, of the past they had survived together. The snow fell gently around them, and for the first time in her life, Lori felt truly at home. As they walked back to the warmth of their house, hand in hand, the door closing behind them, they knew that no matter what storms lay ahead, they had found their way home. They were safe. They were finally completely home. And as the storm began to fall again outside, they knew that they would face it together.